Loneliness is the poverty of self. Solitude is the richness of self. May Sarton. There's a challenge I've faced since I can remember. A shadow that's followed me since I was a boy. As I move through the world, I'm starting to have this feeling that a lot more people are facing this issue than I ever could have imagined. From the time I was a child, I've been confronted with the fear of being completely honest about my feelings and perspectives of people. Upon reflection, I've ultimately realized this is due to a fear of being rejected and ostracized. However, this inner conflict has continually produced feelings of loneliness. I decided to look for solutions for this problem, and I discovered the archetypal narrative of the silent sufferer. A great example of the silent sufferer archetype is the character of Bertie from The King's Speech. This archetypal narrative, represented in his character arc, is essentially broken down into 5 stages, which are 1. Suppressed emotions, 2. Isolation, 3. Personal growth, 4. External conflicts, 5. Transformation. So taking the King's Speech as a frame of reference, we can look to Bertie's character for wisdom. Bertie has a speech impediment, which from a psychological perspective is symbolic of repressed emotions, which is stage 1 of the archetype. One way of considering this is through the lens of the shadow, which is a concept originally formed by Carl Jung. The shadow represents the hidden or repressed aspects of an individual's personality, the dark pieces of ourselves we keep hidden away. The silent sufferer archetype often embodies this concept by suppressing or concealing their inner turmoil and emotions. This emotional restriction is an embodiment of the concept of the shadow. You can see how parts of the self that are not fully integrated into one's personality can lead to feelings of discomfort that spill out into broader arenas of one's life. This brings us to stage 2, isolation. Bertie's isolation, due to his speech impediment, symbolizes the emotional and psychological isolation that can occur when one hides their true feelings or vulnerabilities. We could understand this through the Jungian lens of the persona, which is the social mask that people present to the outside world. The silent sufferer archetype frequently maintains a composed and strong facade symbolizing the persona. The silent sufferer can project an image of strength and self-reliance even when they are experiencing inner turmoil. I actually want to focus on these 2 stages for a moment because it feels to me that this is really the core of the problem. Both the shadow and the persona serve a function, but we need to be in right relationship to both in order to operate optimally in the world. So the shadow contains cut-off parts of our personality. This could be due to trauma, societal and environmental pressure, or maybe even parts of our personality that we ourselves can't accept. In Bertie's case, he suffered from childhood trauma, and this has resulted in the loss of confidence in his own voice, leaving him with a stammer. There was deep-seated pain and anger that wasn't being addressed within him, and the repression was perpetuating his speech impediment. So we can understand this as his avoidance and repression of his shadow, which has manifested in persistent and ongoing psychophysiological issues. If we pair this with the weight of his persona, it helps to explain much of his repression, as he was expected by society to be composed and dignified, as well as confident, and the leader and voice of his country. The weight of this would have cemented the problem of his repression in place. This part is especially interesting for me because this is when something caught my attention. While this was all taking place, Bertie seemed somewhat knowledgeable of his shadow as he knew and remembered his trauma clearly. But it was the extraordinary pressure of his persona that kept him from truly addressing it. This kept him suffering and unable to really integrate his shadow. This feels uncannily familiar to me. I consider myself as someone quite well acquainted with their own shadow. Yet while I have developed an awareness of my shadow, It's the pressure of my persona that has both limited the awareness of my shadow and blocked me from integrating it more thoroughly and successfully in my life. I think this is at the heart of the original problem I presented, one often being afraid to be totally honest for fear of rejection. So how does Bertie overcome this? This brings us to stage 3 of the archetypal narrative, personal growth, the stage where things start to shift. During this stage, Bertie seeks speech therapy and confronts his speech impediment, which symbolizes a willingness to confront suppressed emotions and psychological wounds. So in essence, he challenges the persona. He risks confronting and exposing the shadow with another person. His willingness to be honest and candid is what appears to loosen the iron grip of the persona, and his ultimate fears of not living up to society's expectations of him. This allows him the opportunity to start actually addressing his pain. Now, of course, this is no walk in the park, and it comes with cycles of frustration. Oftentimes, addressing grief is not a linear experience. This brings in stage 4, external conflicts. This is a crucial part of the story because Bertie is challenging the status quo internally, which of course is then reflected externally. He is literally starting to find his voice, which leads to conflict with his brother, but also with his speech therapist, the very person helping him overcome this problem. This brings us to the final stage of the archetypal narrative, transformation. Bertie's ability to overcome his speech impediment symbolizes a transformation from psychological and emotional suppression to self-acceptance, empowerment, and the ability to communicate effectively. So the archetypal narrative indicates that the solution to this problem is in the combination of both challenging the persona and becoming more familiar with the shadow, as well as the experience of external conflict. It's the mixing of these two stages, personal growth and external conflicts, that produces transformation. It makes sense that the external conflict is a part of the transformation because integration moves beyond theory and into embodiment. If you had never stood on a skateboard, but had studied all the many ways to stand and position your feet, it wouldn't be until you actually stood on top of the board for real and crashed a few times before you could claim to know how to skate. So if we revisit the initial challenge I presented, it was a fear of being rejected or ostracized if I was completely honest about my thoughts and feelings, resulting in a feeling of loneliness. So now, having unpacked the component of the shadow and persona, it's understandable where the feeling of loneliness comes from. The feeling of loneliness is the result of a deep disconnection from oneself, the shadow aspect, and settling for a shallow level of acceptance from one's environment, the persona aspect. It seems the choice is simple but not easy. Either risk rejection in the name of becoming who you really are, or avoid rejection by hiding yourself and silently suffer. The choice appears clear to me. What will you choose?